No mai, haere mai, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. So welcome everybody, my name is Nick Smith and I am the Vice-Chancellor of Victoria University of Wellington Te Herenga Waka, and it's my enormous pleasure today to welcome all of you, family, friends, distinguished guests, academic, professional colleagues, students and our wider community to an event that I've been looking forward to for some time, the inaugural lecture of Professor Dean Knight. There are many elements about Dean. There's Dean the man, there's Dean the scholar, there's Dean the public intellectual. And I was asking Dean, as I often do before these events, if he had any anecdotes, humorous or otherwise, that would humanise him and give a context to the towering intellect that we have sitting in the front row. It was very clear that the answer was no. But I've had others who I've met between the photo and here who have embellished other elements about him. So starting in that order, starting with the man. As anyone who knows him, in addition to his love of law, Dean has a love of coffee and a love of rugby. He's an avid rugby player. He's played throughout his university career, both in Aotearoa and overseas, and as yet, and I have some trepidation in saying this and some concern, not just for Dean, but for the university and the law school, he's yet to properly retire. He continues to play with his local club, who are named the Mixed Veggies, and as I have learnt in the last 5 minutes, every player in the Mixed Veggies has their own vegetable, and Dean, and you can read into this what you like, is known as Deadly Nightshade. He also founded Aotearoa's first gay men's rugby team, and over the years he's continued to strongly advocate for gay and inclusive rugby through the International Network of Gay Rugby Clubs. He served as chair and has recently been recognised as a life member of what that global association is. If we then move to the Dean, the academic, and starting at the beginning, he's an alumnus of this esteemed law school and this wonderful university, Te Herenga Waka. He began his academic journey here, up in Kelburn, and then in a way that he covers so many spheres of life, he transitioned seamlessly down to when this building was opened. He completed a Bachelor of Law with honours and a Bachelor of Commerce and Administration. He then moved overseas and completed a Master of Laws at UBC, the University of British Columbia, and a PhD at the London School of Economics and Political Science, where he further, as I understand, refined his taste for coffee. He rejoined the university as an academic in 2005, and after a number of years practicing with an Australasian law firm, and has specialised in litigation, public law and local government. It's in that role that he has built an impressive series of academic credentials covering judicial review of administration and action, local government and democracy, and constitutional reform. He's been involved in the New Zealand Centre for Public Law, co-chaired the Australasian chapter of International Society of Public Law, and an executive committee member for the Law Society and Association of Australia and New Zealand. But if we then seamlessly move into the third domain, or the third theme I'd like to talk about, he has transitioned not just within the ivory tower, but out to become a genuine public intellectual. And at a time when universities are reasserting not only what we are good at, but what we are good for, this is such an important role for all of us. He's received the Universities New Zealand Critic and Conscience Society Award last year for his exceptional contribution to providing independent expert commentary on issues impacting New Zealand community and future generations. He's served on editorial committees of not just the Victoria University of Wellington Law Review and Legalities, but also the Australian New Zealand Journal Society of Law. He has inspired generations of students in our law school. And I regularly talk to law students and I often ask them who their favourite lecturer is. And while the other names occasionally come up, he is a perennial favourite among our law students. In 2021, he was awarded the Teaching Excellence Award, an accolade for the educator whose teaching philosophy focuses on creating curious citizens in a capital city. He does this by infusing lessons with his passion for public law, building intellectual communities through collegial discussion-based learning, challenging students to engage with and learn from the civic world that surrounds them. And for any of the students who have come to his lecture, I also noticed that he hands out donuts. His inaugural lecture today is wise decisions, government accountability in a smallish democracy. I'm hoping and expecting that Dean will examine government decision making, discuss the processes that ensure accountability, and evaluate how well these processes encourage wise decisions. Consider how the small size of our democracy affects decision making and once again fosters accountability. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my huge pleasure to welcome to the lectern Professor Dean Knight.
Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa, ko Dean Knight ahau. Greetings everyone, my name is Dean Knight. I mihi ana ki te iwi kāinga o tēnei rohi. I'd like to acknowledge the people to whom the place we meet tonight is precious. And kia ora e hoa mā. Greetings, friends. Greetings in the 3 official languages of our nation. And can I add warm Pacific greetings too, Talofa Lava especially. Thank you to the Vice-Chancellor for the lovely words of welcome and giving away my secrets. And to you, my family, friends, colleagues, and fellow constitutional train spotters for joining for some rants and reckons on wise decisions, government accountability, and a smallish democracy. I want to start by saying it's lovely delivering these remarks in a place that very much feels like home. This has been my house of law for many decades. You've heard from the Vice-Chancellor as a student in the mid-1990s, and then as a lecturer from 2005 onwards. And I am blessed to have joined a vibrant faculty with folk who care deeply about education and are passionate about illuminating law and life through research and scholarship, and professional staff who tirelessly support us in that mission. E hoa mahi mā, kia ora, colleagues. I think of these halls as our civic space, where we join together in community for conversations about law, life and learning, conversations about the ups and downs of society, conversations about how collectively through our democratic processes we can grapple with the wicked problems of our world and ultimately improve the well-being of our peoples. That starts with curiosity and asking good questions and requires good citizenship built on humility and empathy to unlock the power of cooperation. To be honest, the only slight regret is tonight's remarks are entirely didactic. I cherish law's tradition here at Te Heranga Waka of learning through collaborative dialogue, discussion-based learning. The language of the Socratic method has rightly been largely retired, so too the anxiety of the seating chart, replaced in my classes with yellow cardboard nameplates for all. But if any of you wants to take a question mid-lecture, just feel free to give me a nod. Now in Te Reo, learning and teaching are combined as one, as ako, recognising the reciprocity that exists in education. And in that spirit, please treat these remarks as beginning a conversation that I hope might follow tonight, where we continue to learn from each other on this important topic. First, though, a little bit more about my pathway to this lectern tonight, and you've heard some of that from the VC. And I've been pondering about the turns that have brought me here. Honestly, I think it's been quite happenstance, although there have probably been some prescient moments. I grew up in the Pohangana Valley in the Manawatu, son of a sheep farmer and primary school teacher, and it's lovely to have Dad, taking notes I hope, in the front row. My late mum would have loved to have been here too, but I still get the real sense of joy when the occasional student in one of my classes comes up to say they were taught by Mrs. Knight at primary school in Ashurst, and for them to remember her real passion for learning. So a farm boy along with my siblings Reese and Bronwyn, who are here tonight also, and I should confess probably a reluctant farm boy who escaped to the capital city as soon as he could. but first educated at a rural school, then on to a small, low decile state co-ed high school in Palmerston North, Freiburg High School, a school where teachers involved pupils in governance and the stewardship of community in a way that was actually quite unusual at the time. Now, one particular memory from that time is a letter to the editor in the Evening Standard about a decision taken at a fellow school to suspend and expel a pupil for drinking half a can of beer on a school ski trip. Breach of a zero tolerance rule about alcohol, it was said. Well, some 17-year-old boy thought that that was fair and unfair and wrong. And you can see those rants and reckons started early, it seems. Unfair and wrong. Though I didn't know it at the time, the school's actions were successfully challenged in the High Court by judicial review. In the M and Sims case. Sims was one of my rugby coaches, by the way. And it's a case I continue to teach public law students today. So hold that incident in the back of your mind. We'll come back to it now and then. University followed, first in family to do so, I think. Ambitions for accounting and finance, but soon falling in love with the intrigue of law, with passionate lecturers who helped grow my love for law and government. And good friends were happy to lend me notes for the lectures I missed, or chew the fat about law while playing pinball till all hours of the morning. I'll nod to some other points on the journey as I go. But here's where I'd like to start exploring ideas about wise decisions, government accountability within the context of our smallest democracy. Because at the heart of my discipline, whether you describe it as public law, constitutional administrative law, or government law, lies the aspiration for good decision-making and robust accountability. And our challenge is identifying, designing, appraising, and improving the structures and processes that contribute to that aspiration for a system operated by humans, and in Aotearoa New Zealand by relatively small numbers of humans. Now, I want to talk about judicial review at some depth, including its strengths and weaknesses in the Good Governance Project, before positioning it amongst its siblings in the network of accountability processes alongside their contribution. Tonight's not a night for a big normative argument. It's more reflections about how we might think about accountability and wise decision making and where that inquiry might take us. First, something about accountability. An accountability that is dialogical. There are many ways we might define accountability, but I'm a real fan of Mark Boven's framing of accountability as a social relationship. For him, accountability is a relationship between an actor and forum in which an actor has an obligation to explain and to justify their conduct to the forum, who can then pose questions and pass judgment. And the actor may face consequences as a result. Now, this is focused on ex post facto appraisal of a decision, whether expressed politically, legally, or as a form of learning. Of course, we also control power in other ways, especially the way we distribute power or structure its exercise. And importantly, in a small democracy, by enlisting good people, channeling their spirit of service and honing their bureaucratic skills. But here I'm looking at responsibility after the fact. And we'll vividly remember that natural dialogue arising from, for example, ministerial responsibility. There's a direct and formal accountability relationship between ministers as actors and Parliament as a forum. Ministers are expected to explain and justify matters that happen in their portfolios. MPs then interrogate ministers and make judgments about their stewardship of government office. Witness here oral and written questions or ministerial appearances before select committees, especially during our new wonderful scrutiny weeks. Judgment is typically expressed informally, often in parliamentary debates, or utterances outside Parliament to the media and the public. And ministers may then face consequences, such as public opprobrium or diminished electoral prospects. And if the confidence of their colleagues or the electorate is sorely tested, loss of office. These political accountability conversations, we hope, help ensure wise decisions are made. And for me, thinking about accountability in this way is helpful because it foregrounds relationships, expression, and dialogue. And that idea of governing and overseeing as a form of expression and dialogue is also one that Justice Matthew Palmer and I tried to amplify in our recent book on the Constitution, especially the different voices used by different actors within the system. Kia ora, Matthew. Now, my partner, Alan, is the linguist in the family, and he tells me that law should actually be talking about discourse, not dialogue. Kind of take his point on that. But I just would like at this moment to pause and acknowledge his love, support, and feedback during my intellectual journey and our life together. Thank you. Whawhitai. So how does this conception of accountability animate the mechanisms of administrative law, especially my first love, judicial review? Let's be honest, this isn't the way folk normally speak about judicial review. Judicial review is often presented as the gold standard mechanism of administrative law, the rule of law in action, where we tell our students, I think I make them raise their hands, we say the rule of law. Judges riding in on their white horses, coming to the defence of citizens oppressed by some action by the massive state apparatus, using their special juridical power to cure defects in the decision or decision-making process. The premier remedial jurisdiction. Spoiler alert, this model of administrative law and judicial review, sometimes described as a red light, grounded in classic libertarian philosophy, now leaves me somewhat cold. I still remember the moment reading, unsurprisingly, in a cafe in Vancouver while working on my LLM thesis at UBC under the supervision of Phil Bryden and Wes Pugh. It was then that I discovered the green light, the natural contradistinction to the red. A different model of control and accountability as explained by Carol Harlow and Rick Rawlings, based on a different theory of the state, more concerned with the promotion of prudential decision-making in the collective interest in order to improve in order to improve community well-being. Importantly for me, with an appreciation of how our governors as human beings make decisions and how they are influenced by our complex system of settings, incentives, processes and cultures. This conception is obviously communitarian in purpose and echoes the work of the realist movement, along with Martin Laughlin's functional style, most interested in how power and law is applied in practice. Of course, in Aotearoa New Zealand, we might nod to Sir Geoffrey's work, the new public law from the 1990s, where he exhorted us to be concerned about the sprawling mass of reality about how public law decisions are made and how decision makers can be influenced in the content of those decisions. And can I meet to Sir Geoffrey, there he is, my former teacher. As a student, I still remember reading your manifesto for public law in that heavy pink-covered course book, and it's an extract that I still share with students today. But back to judicial review and its place in administrative law. And I know there's a few lay folk here, a few rugby players at the back too, I think. So I need to explain a little bit more about judicial review. On a basic level, as you may have picked up, judicial review is exactly what it says. It's review by a judge. Government decisions can be challenged in court to determine their propriety. Now, in reality, it's a little more complex. So we might sharpen our definition a bit. Judicial review is review of discretionary governmental decisions by judges of the High Court in accordance with the principles of administrative law. There's a fair bit in that, and I just want to explain it in a slightly rejigged order. The idea of discretionary decisions reminds us that Parliament has deliberately delegated discretionary power, the power to choose and decide, to ministers, officials and public bodies, often in circumstances when it's more efficient and effective for decisions to be made on an individualised basis, adapted in the light of a person's individual circumstances and the concrete facts applying, by those with particular expertise and experience and with the nimbleness to deliberate in ways that suit the type of the decision before them. So think of the rector at Palmerston North Boys High School being charged with decisions about discipline, whether an infraction meets the legislative test of misconduct. Principals, rectors know that, and they know the context of the school and the school grounds. Now, the idea of governmental decisions tells us judicial review is a creature of public law and is interested in the propriety of decisions which have some degree of publicness or governmentness, either institutionally, a decision made by a public actor, or functionally, a decision with a governmental character, even if made by someone other than a state official, or conceptually, and this is, I think, the best way to think about it, a normative judgment that accountability for a particular decision is best rendered against public law standards. So that's governmental decisions. The idea of review tells us the court's role is supervisory only. It's not the court's role to perform the judge of ministers, officials, or public bodies, or to substitute their view for that of the primary decision maker. And there's good constitutional reasons for that. First and more foremost, that deliberate delegation of authority by the legislature to the executive. The court's role is more limited, but still important. Reference to the High Court, judges of the High Court, that reminds us that judicial review is part of the constitutional birthright of our senior courts and is a creature of the common law. We don't need to look to Parliament to legitimise the authority of the courts to supervise governmental decision making. The power to do so arises from the very idea of constitutional balance. Judicial review is where our grand constitutional principles, the rule of law, legislative supremacy, separation of powers, democracy, it's where those principles are operationalised and where the interaction is mediated. Finally, the principles of administrative law provide the standards for appraising the governmental decision. Decision makers are expected, in general terms, to avoid illegality, procedural impropriety, and irrationality. But each of those expectations has a much more granular set of expectations lying underneath. Generally speaking, too, these standards are created by judges according to their normative vision of justice and the rule of law. In other words, judges are responsible both for designing the expectations of decision makers and the general rules about how the courts will scrutinise governmental decisions and applying those rules in individual cases when hearing and determining applications for judicial review. Repeat again, judicial review is a creature of the common law. That said, the intentions and wishes of Parliament, our elected branch of government, still heavily colour the assessment of the propriety of decision making. Because much of judicial review is about ensuring the exercise of power by the delegate is faithful to the terms of the delegation. Thus, in practice, many of the expectations policed by the courts on judicial review will be Parliament's instructions about how a particular decision, a particular power should be exercised, intertwined with those general common law rules. Now, it might seem a little bit odd, but in judicial review cases, judges don't get to rule on whether they think the decision is wise or not. Their role is keeping an eye out for flaws in the application of the law or the process adopted, such as an incorrect understanding or application of the law, a failure to take into account relevant considerations, taking into account something that is irrelevant, making the decision for the wrong motives or for an improper purpose, not personally exercising the discretion entrusted to them, not following the required process, such as by not following the legislative steps, adopting an unfair process, or failing to give those particularly affected a say, or failing to act impartially. And those are some of the more granular grounds of review that sit under the tripartite grounds that I started with. And the rector, in the Sims case, remember that, failed on several counts. Misunderstood the meaning of gross misconduct. Didn't consider all the relevant circumstances. Why? Because he rigidly applied a school policy and excluded his personal exercise of discretion. Now, the substantive outcome and reasons are only scrutinised to make sure the decision is not absurd, illogical or egregious, and that the decision maker hasn't taken leave of their senses or acted irrationally. In other words, the courts will check that the decision is not manifestly unreasonable, or occasionally, perhaps in some contexts, not unreasonable in the ordinary sense. Importantly, the merits of the decision, as we call it, are off limit to the courts. By that we mean fact-finding, evaluation, the weight to be given to the factors that should be considered, and the overall judgment and reasoning. And in the Sims case, the judge reminded himself that it was not his job to decide what the optimal decision was. It was sufficient for him to note that the suspension or expulsion was open to the rector if he properly grappled with the matter. Now, that divide between law and process on the one hand and substance and merits on the other is fundamental. It recognises constitutional principles in play, including legislative supremacy and the separation of powers, acknowledging that Parliament gave the job to decide to a particular executive actor, not the courts, for good reason. But it also recognises that the rule of law and other principles mandate an important role for the courts in policing the legal framework and the process for the decision to be taken. Judges need to balance, as I put it, the competing impulses of both vigilance on the one hand and restraint on the other. Now, we might be able to explain that in institutional relational terms. Two questions are implicated in judicial review, as Tom Poole explains. First, there's first-order questions of individual justice and the propriety, the wisdom of a particular decision, the wise decision angle. And second-order institutional questions about whether and how much the supervising court should quibble with or second-guess the decision of the primary decision-maker. Alternatively, we can talk about a principle of relativity, as Timothy Endicott invites us to, as a way of acknowledging that carefully navigated relationship between the supervising court and primary decision maker. Now, our tradition here in Aotearoa New Zealand has been to hardwire those questions of balance into grounds of review with pretty rigid categories with pretty rigid categories and predetermined balance. And the judges bring variability by fitting things into different categories in individual cases. But I'm not sure we can continue to rely on our suite of grounds to do the sophisticated work we demand of them. And I'm resisting the urge, looking at my clock here, for a deep dive here into some hardcore methodological questions and the appropriate design of judicial review's metastructure. This was my PhD project at the London School of Economics under the guidance of Tom Poole and Martin Lachlan. But just forgive me, I guess, a brief rant for the train spotters. I worry the evolution of administrative law has unsettled the lay of the land. Whether it's the complexities of human rights, whether it's the constitutional shifting of gears when te tiriti or waitangi or tikanga are implicated, or when the global and the domestic legal systems come into contact. Even structural changes to the state and the ebb and flow of the public-private divide unsettle the usual balance. And modern-day legal drafting, often overlooked, complicates things too, with more sophisticated instructions being included with Parliament's delegation of power, the evolution of public law. Now, can I just pause here and say, and just acknowledge my colleagues here at Vic and Mahi elsewhere in the Motu, who are experts in these different aspects of law and who have enriched my appreciation of them through conversations and scholarship. It's through collaboration that we've been able to take the intellectual journey forward. And there's many of those people in this room. I acknowledge you and others elsewhere. Back to judicial review. In judicial review, we all agree context matters, circumstances matters. And there's much agreement, at least theoretically, on the key factors and contexts which are going to change that balance. Things like relative expertise, whether the primary decision maker or supervisory court is more adept at solving the question and issue. Institutional competence, whether the processes available to the primary decision maker or supervisory court are more suitable for resolving the question, especially any forensic limitations facing the court. might be the magnitude of the decision, whether the effect of the decision is significant, including the extent to which the decision seriously implicates fundamental human rights or other constitutional norms. And I say cognate accountability, whether other grievance mechanisms provide adequate accountability not. But how should this context affect supervisory method? That's what we're still debating. I'm doubting our grounds of review approach based around pre-existing balances is responsive enough. But there are other options. An intensity of review approach would bring these dynamics to the foreground by inviting courts to explicitly work through those different contextual factors to decide the depth of scrutiny to be applied in any particular case. And a contextual review approach moves completely away from doctrine and leaves the court to decide in the round and in the light of the particular circumstances whether something has gone wrong of the nature and degree that justifies the intervention of the court. It's fair to say there are pros and cons of each of these approaches, especially when judged against the rule of law. But I worry a problem of language is hindering our ability to shape an approach which is fit for the challenges of today and tomorrow. Our judicial review discipline in New Zealand has so far failed to negotiate a standardised way of talking about this idea of relativity or that balance. And I worry we've got bogged down in debates about language. Deference, latitude, variable intensity, heightened scrutiny, hard look, margin of appreciation, contextualism, and let's add from recent days, comity as well. The language of deference is especially unloved here, it seems, despite it being terminology which has strong currency elsewhere in the common law world. Worries perhaps about a sense of judicial subservience and unfaithfulness to the rule of law, but worries that I think are misplaced, especially in the light of David Deisenhouse's famous characterisation as deference as respect and the democratic virtue of judicial humility. I wonder if Tom Hickman's language of weight, whether and how much weight should be given to the views of others, here the primary decision maker, might be a more familiar term and a pragmatic compromise that better fits our linguistic culture. In any event, it's method, not language, that is my prime concern. But watch the space as this question of relativity, or margin of appreciation as it was called, is before the Supreme soon, and an appeal relating to vaccination and Defence Force readiness requirements. Don't pop your popcorn just yet. Let's see what they do with that. And that's enough. Wake up, guys, back there. Tricky methodological questions embedded in the job of supervision. I want to come back to that question of what's judicial review got to do with wise decisions and government accountability. I want to start first with accountability. And we can redraw judicial review as a form of dialogical accountability beyond its traditional rule of law framing. And in doing so, centre on ministers, officials and public bodies as actors, and actors in conversations designed to engender an exact accountability. So continuing Boven's structure of actor forum, the other key participant in that conversation is the court, the High Court, as the forum for accountability, supported in many respects by an applicant who has prompted the need for an account to be rendered and scrutinised. Ministers, officials and public bodies render account by explicating what they did and explaining why they say it is justified, and justified in terms of good governance expectations that are previously outlined. The supervising court, in conjunction with an affected applicant, interrogates that account, both directly through contestation and indirectly through the presentation of a counter-narrative. And ultimately, judgment is exacted through a ruling by the supervising court, explaining whether the proffered explanation passes muster. Consequences then flow, especially if the appraisal was adverse. Remedies changing legal settings may be issued. In other words, the applicant may have the interference or adverse treatment remedied, at least through a directive that the decision maker must have another go at making the decision. Or consequences may come home to roost for the decision maker themselves. Again, opprobrium, loss of reputation, or even office. Now, this framing as dialogical accountability is subtle, but shifts the emphasis back to the familiar idea of rendering account and our culture of justification, at least against specific legally concentrated expectations. But what did judicial review and wise decisions? I just want to make some observations about this. We're seeing first that the courts on judicial review don't ask whether a decision is wise per se. In fact, they're admonished not to. At best, the courts on judicial review ensure there is a sound framework and strong settings which encourage good decision making by the primary decision maker. And there's some real virtue in that. Secondly, and to put it another way, I guess, judicial review is ostensibly more concerned with bad decisions than good. Judicial review is negative and parasitic. It's on the hunt for flaws. Operationalised in terms of grounds of review framed as bases of judicial intervention. That said, I think we can acknowledge some hortatory or educative role for the court, but only if we reinterpret and flip the grounds of review into a positive statement about prudential decision making. A tripartite duty to act reasonably, fairly, in accordance with law, as Lord Coke once put it. That's a rough, but perhaps too abstract model of decision making. And as the justiciable flaws get more granular and context becomes more complicated, there's a risk some things might get lost in translation. The inverse of a ground of review may not squarely express a meaningful duty for the decision maker. But there's some promising work on this front. It's pleasing to see the Crown Law's bureaucratic Bible for officials drop the negative framing "a judge over your shoulder" in favour of te po arahi, people who provide guidance and direction, and make a fair fist of speaking directly to decision makers about what good decisions might look like. But there's a fair bit of interpretive licence being brought to bear on that project, and it's a tricky one. Thirdly, there's some uncertainty and doubt about how influential judicial review actually is in practice. Sure, anecdotally, we can all recall instances where an adverse ruling on judicial review has led to positive changes to the underlying decision-making practices. And I have in mind especially immigration rulings on the relevance of international law obligations. Others here from government will also know others too. I'd love to hear more about them. But we haven't corroborated the systemic cultural reaction to judicial review in empirical studies. We lack the large and longitudinal empirical studies of England and elsewhere about the impact of judicial review on decision-making in government. Something for the future, perhaps. In terms of frequency, we reckon, and it's a little bit more than a reckon, but we reckon there's about 250 judicial review decisions a year, based on a pilot project undertaken by Eddie Clark, William Britton and me a few years ago. Just pause there and compare that to the magnitude of decisions, the number of decisions made by the state each and every day. As the smallest democracy, we can literally put all the judicial review decisions for a year into a folder or two and then analyse the numbers, the people involved and the trends. But it's only a work in progress at the moment and much more to be done there. So it's probably not unfair to say that judicial review here remains sporadic and peripheral, as Stanley de Smith described the position in England in 1958. We suffer, as Justice Hammond put it, from problems of supply. Judges don't get to appraise many decisions, and often whole fields of decision-making avoid the judicial eye. We also tend to get overexcited, and I'm guilty of this, overexcited by current developments, where we probably make more about a single case than might be warranted. And the paucity of cases, and this is probably the fourth point, also speaks to one of the drawbacks of judicial review. Making an application to the High Court is a big deal, formidable, expensive, and reliant on savvy lawyers, and out of reach of many. Concerns about accessibility and the privilege of some speak loudly here. How many parents can afford to seek judicial review when their kid gets suspended from the rowing team for riding suitcases on the baggage carousel? Accessibility and privilege. Finally, there might be a subtle shift of orientation taking place in judicial review itself of late. As judges are positioning or repositioning themselves more squarely in the good governance project through the selection of a particular form of remedy. And this is a work in progress for me at the moment. Because I think we're increasingly seeing the courts grant declarations only, declaratory relief only, pronouncing an answer on a legal question or inviting or identifying a rule of law defect without going on to quash or modify the decision lying at the heart of the challenge through their coercive powers. We're seeing that a lot in fertility cases, along with many of the judicial review cases challenging pandemic restrictions. In doing so, I think the courts are speaking more directly to decision makers about good decision making than alleviating individual justice for citizens through coercive remedies, albeit perhaps complainants may still feel vindicated by those words on the page. So stepping back, I think it's a relatively mixed scorecard for judicial review in its relationship with wise decision making, perhaps with some pressure that they do more. But let's put judicial review to one side and let the green light shine a bit brighter. Because within our smallest democracy, there are a myriad of other institutions and mechanisms that encourage good decision making and provide a mechanism for students to raise citizens to raise grievances and seek accountability. I've never told them to go to the High Court. I'm talking of folk like the Ombuds, the Auditor General, Regulations Review Committee, Administrative Tribunals and Inquiries, Waitangi Tribunal, and other watchdogs. I worry that these bodies often sit in the shadow of judicial review. We might think of these bodies as comprising the integrity branch of government. I'll say that again. We might think of these bodies as comprising the integrity branch of government. Because our traditional division of branches of government are three: legislative, executive, judiciary, I think, or I wonder about whether it's still fit for purpose. And we can just recall how folk got tied up in knots recently trying to explain the constitutional place of the Waitangi Tribunal. For me, the answer lies in remapping our institutions rather than trying to shoehorn them into existing blunt categories. And some scholars of government law abroad are awake to this blind spot. And it's now become fashionable to label these organisations as part of the fourth branch of government, or guarantor institutions. That is, those institutions charged with ensuring fidelity in governance and promoting a healthy democracy. For myself, I prefer that language of integrity branch. It's been sometimes used in Australia, as I think it neatly expresses the function, integrity. Of course, if we adopt a truly functional classification, it might be the courts on judicial review fall within that integrity branch too, separate from their work adjudicating inter partes disputes between citizens, but that might be a tad too radical. There's also a case, I think, to be made for universities as knowledge institutions to be recognised in the integrity branch, especially in the light of our mandated critic and conscience role. The value of the integrity branch brand is it brings the heavy lifting of these other institutions into the daylight, commensurate with the strength and frequency of their contribution to the good governance project. Often these bodies only wield soft power, the power to counsel, recommend, encourage without coercive force. But they're often masterful in how they provide accountability and promote good decision making in ways that are both familiar and distinctive. Take, for example, the Ombuds. In their maladministration jurisdiction, they're empowered to hear complaints or investigate decisions made by departments, officials, and many public bodies. Their ultimate power is only recommendatory. They have no power to quash decisions, but they can recommend that decisions be retaken, apologies be issued, practices changed. More importantly, the basis on which they judge the justification of governmental decisions differs from the courts on judicial review. Sure, they're charged with ensuring the decisions are lawful, reasonable, and made by a proper process, but they can call out decisions also if they're based on factual error, unlike on judicial review, perhaps. Based on legislation or practices that are unjust or discriminatory, or even if they're wrong in the Ombuds's opinion. The short point is the accountability conversation here has a different focus or accent. And the modality of those conversations is different too. More inquisitorial, more informal, more collaborative. And that still all fits with our framework of dialogical accountability. You can't put up the slide, but you'll remember the list. Actor, we're talking about departments and officials. Forum is the Ombuds. The explanation and interrogation is based around a broader set of maladministration standards. Judgment is expressed in a form of correspondence or opinion, and consequences may flow, not through coercive power, but through soft power and a different suite of advisory options. Just last week, the Ombuds recommended a school apologise to a pupil for the improper way it made the decision to expel them. Or another school case for failing to provide any reasons for a decision. Again, something that may not be forthcoming with the court. And we can scale up that analysis across the integrity branch, to foreground how the nature of the accountability conversations differ due to the different standards and benchmarks. For example, the Auditor General's focus on effectiveness and efficiency, waste and probity, and financial prudence, and a deep concern for systemic improvement. We get to appreciate the different ways a justification is rendered and interrogated. For example, the way the Waitangi Tribunal explores putative treaty breaches by inquiry processes based in tikanga and with a rich focus on history and narrative. And to recognise how different consequences may flow from judgment exacted by different forums. For example, the way the gravitas of the Regulations Review Committee underscores the force of its concerns when expressed in collegial correspondence with ministers and select committees. And that's not just an explanatory or descriptive exercise. Characterising the accountability conversation this way also allows us to engage in more systemic normative exercise, assessing the efficacy of each and their collective effectiveness too. Does the conversation with the forum in practice avoid the concentration and misuse or abuse of power from a legal or constitutional perspective? Does it ensure the legitimacy of our governors through their responsiveness to the preferences of those they serve, a democratic or political perspective? Does it promote the effectiveness and efficiency of outcomes through continuous feedback and improvement, a learning perspective? Different evaluative criteria needed for different types of accountability conversations. And as mentioned also, the strength of the different forms of accountability is not irrelevant to judicial review, as relativity in judicial review is often responsive to the force of non-judicial accountability. Ultimately, this is an attempt to take us beyond merely saying more accountability is good, hooray. The design of the state and arc of administrative law has undoubtedly ushered in more instances of accountability, more supervision, more judgment. But in doing so, accountability has become atomised, leaving us feeling like there is less responsibility. Isn't that a paradox? So as well as ensuring the accountability conversations on a micro level are providing value, we also need to be able to re-aggregate those conversations to hear the chorus of the choir too. And here I know the Office of the Auditor General especially is doing some excellent reflective work in a series of discussion paper on this changing nature and expectations of accountability. But whatever way we look at it, accountability in New Zealand, in Aotearoa New Zealand, accountability in Aotearoa New Zealand is a complex system with many moving parts. So just to conclude, tonight I've shared with you some different ways of thinking about accountability of the administrative state and how our legal processes contribute to wise decision making. In many respects, the trajectory of these remarks from the glitzy lights of judicial review, red lights perhaps, towards a complex network of accountability conversations replicates the trajectory of my own intellectual discovery, and importantly, I think, a research agenda that sits ahead. Thanks for sharing in that journey with me,
Kia ora. Thank you.
My name is Jeff McLean. I'm the Acting Dean of the Law Faculty. Before I begin properly, I just want to acknowledge that while there are many old faces in the room, well known to us, there are many new faces in the room, some of whom I fear may be the first time they've ever been in a university law school. But I'd just like to say that whether you're an old friend or a new acquaintance, we welcome you to this very long expected party. You're very welcome. We're insanely proud of our little law school. We know we can always do better and do things more equally, more fairly, but we are insanely proud for some of the reasons you have already seen tonight. What I want to do is first of all to say something about the lecture and then to say something about Dean. The two parts are really divided into Professor Knight and Dean. But before I do that, I particularly want to welcome the Knight Went Ainga. It's really great to see you here. I particularly acknowledge Craig, Dean's father, and I acknowledge Mrs. Knight of Ashurst. You must be also insanely proud of your Dean, as I'm sure your mother would have been too, Dean. I also, just on behalf of my colleagues, want to acknowledge Alan. There are other academic spouses in the room. It is not an easy gig. Academic life is not the bells and whistles, sweet roses that everybody thinks it is. There are other people in this room who are constantly ribbing us about that. But it's hard work, and it's hard work supporting it. So I just want to acknowledge you on all of our behalves with thanks, gratitude, and awe. So I just want to say some things about Professor Knight's lecture. There are three, it seems to me, purposes of inaugural lectures, even if they're delivered after someone's delivered several thousand lectures probably in this room. The first is to show accomplishment. The second is to show that he actually has some content, i.e. he knows something. And B, to promise what he's going to do in the future. Now, I'm not going to speak about Dean's accomplishment because it's self-evident and obvious from what you've seen already. I would like to speak a lot about the content, but at 7:30 last night, I despaired of receiving Dean's lecture. So, the good colleague that I am, I did suggest a number of other lectures that Dean could give tonight, and he has not delivered any of them. My particular favourite is why you shouldn't trust the man who gives out donuts in his class. Another one was, it's not even a vibe. Dean looked away saying public law is a vibe. It's not even, whether it's even law at all. Dean hasn't given that lecture for the particular reason that as much as my private law soul would like those things to be true, it absolutely isn't for the Dean, for the reasons that Dean has given us tonight so eloquently. One of the mysteries of New Zealand, I'm very glad there won't be comments or questions from the audience, because this may attract at least the ire of one of our distinguished audience. The great mystery of New Zealand public law is not its brokenness, is not what doesn't work. And often the narrative of the last 60 or 70 years, and I say this by people who have been principally responsible for fixing much of that brokenness, is that it remains broken. The central mystery of New Zealand public law, and I think of much of our country, is it actually works. That on the whole, New Zealand is very well governed, as much as we might moan, as much as we might have complaints, as much as we might have secondary school students protesting on the lawn of Parliament about not having classrooms. It actually works in a way that most countries would be deeply and are deeply envious of. And that's the central mystery that Dean's work has engaged tonight. Why it works and how it works, what the role of courts, what the role of decision makers, what the role of lawyers, what the role of these, I'm not going to use the word ombuds, I hate that so much. Ombudsman, the Auditor General, all those other important actors are. And that's the promise of Dean's lecture, that like all law, that history and the future of New Zealand public law remains unwritten. It remains unwritten because A, we just don't know all the things we could. There are some people in this room whose work has illuminated little bits of it, large bits of it. There are people in this room who have made large parts of New Zealand public law, but we still don't understand enough. People misunderstand the point of these functions. They're not celebrations, they're actually challenges. But when you become a professor, you no longer have to worry about PA1 and PA2 forms, the promotion forms at university. You're responsible for what you want to do with the rest of your career. And Dean has shown us in this lecture tonight that that's exactly what he's going to do. The second part of my thanks is to Dean. Now, there are many of our colleagues in this room who will do a much better job of thanking Dean Knight than I will, and I apologise, and you would do a much better job than I would do now. Let the part tell the whole. I can only tell you some things of this extraordinary person. I tried to figure out a word that would summarise Dean. The word teacher, you've heard from the Vice-Chancellor about his excellence awards, but that's actually not Dean's important contribution to teaching. Dean cares in a way that I think very few of us can't, and frankly I find sometimes infuriating about his teaching. He really cares. Teaching public law in New Zealand is not for the faint-hearted. New Zealand has and will always have a deeply contested public law, constitution and constitutional future. That's the reality, and Dean's teaching has been at the forefront of trying to figure out what we can say to our students about this history and this future. Scholar. We could say scholar, and there's plenty of evidence for calling him a scholar. Scholar is a great word, but actually it doesn't really describe the richness of what Dean actually does for many of the reasons the Vice-Chancellor says. Scholar is one thing. Dean is a particular, many of my colleagues particularly, great attention to detail, great in the footnotes. But that's not Dean's only contribution in what he does. That's inadequate as well. I thought we could describe him as a comrade, because Dean and I have been involved in many fights, sometimes against our lovely institution. We are the loyal opposition sometimes. Dissent is not disloyalty, as we know. And the people from Kelvin know that about us. But that probably takes a degree of radicalism that I don't think Dean and I really actually share. The other word that started with C that came to mind was colleague. And colleague is a really good word and describes much of Dean. But colleague is the kind of person you meet at the water cooler once a day and you say, oh, it's great they work in the same building as I do. But that's not actually Dean. The word that I ended up figuring out is a word that's actually much misused now in English. We use just a lot in front of it. It's the word friend. Because Dean is most of all our friend. Dean is our friend who, when you need to have your thesis formatted on the day it's due, will do it for you, all 100,000 words of it. And Dean is also the friend that spends all of that time then instructing you about the wrong font that you've used, and then tell you about how your orphan control is somehow not working. I still don't know what orphan control is. Dean is the friend who you can rant and rave at about a certain attempt to change a certain name. Say to you, oh, actually, I think that's probably a good idea. And then he's such a friend that he figures out a way we can agree by pointing out the administrative failings. Dean is, simply put, the friend of all of us at this law school, and I'd just like to acknowledge that you are deeply loved by the people here. We are deeply honoured to be here tonight to celebrate not just your achievements, but also to challenge you for your future work. So I'd ask you to join me in thanking Professor Dean Knight.